Hi, it's Dr. Myers. Grab a cup of coffee. We're going to be here for a little bit. We're going to talk about the first module that is based upon your current textbook, which is Greenlaw and Shapiro economics. And this is your first quiz-based graded module. At the end of this module, you'll be offered 10 questions. I've talked about that before, and we'll see how you do. Now, in this, there are two chapters that we're going to be talking about. The first of these chapters is Welcome to Economics, and there's a set of learning assessments or learning objectives that you're going to be finding out about as you read through the text. In other words, it's kind of the outline of the text, but more importantly, when the chapter says, in this chapter you will learn about, those are the high level points that the authors are saying. Those are the kind of four things that we're putting in chapter one. And when you take the quiz, you're going to get something very similar, but not exactly the same. For example, the first is define economics and distinguish between microeconomics and macroeconomics. That looks like both point one and two in the text, and indeed it is for the most part. Um, so what you're going to find out in the quiz is you're going to be given a chapter, or a question. Question number three is going to be explain the key ideas that define the economic way of thinking. Well, we've been talking about the economic way of thinking. We talked about it through module 2A. We're going to be talking about it more here. It's just not pointed out directly in the textbook as a learning objective, but it's in there. So you're going to be tested, and question three is always going to be on that economic way of thinking as you go through. Now, there's another chapter in this module, which is about choice. And your book offers there's three parts to the way they've put the chapter together, things that they expect you to learn. And on the test, there is going to be, what is that, six questions. Two of them are define production possibility frontier and calculate opportunity cost. And question one and two are always going to be on that. And again, I've talked about how quizzes are put together elsewhere, so I'm not going to belabor that here. Now, what is economics? It's a comprehensive discipline. Now, when I was getting my degree, I can remember one very uncomfortable place in time where a relative came up to me and said, "Where do I invest my money?" And I went, "Oh, I don't know." And she's saying, "But you're getting a PhD in economics. You know all about this." And I'm going, "No, we don't really study finance. Some economists do. Some get very interested in that. Some do joint majors between finance and economics. But I'm more interested in what motivates people to invest or not. I'm not interested in exactly what the right instruments are out there to use unless it affects my ability to solve a problem." And that's something a lot of people don't understand. Or they put you into a box that says, all right, this is economics, so it's all about money, and it's got to be just things that have prices on it. So economics can't be about whether you get out of bed in the morning. And yeah, and the answer is yes. Economics is all about the decision that you make to get out of bed. And you might be hearing this and going, what are you talking about? Well, we're going to come to a point where we start really focusing in on benefits and cost and making comparisons like that. And you have to, when that alarm goes off, you have to acknowledge that you want to continue to stay in bed often, right? And there's a benefit of that. It feels good. You like it, right? And there's a cost to getting out of bed. And a benefit of getting out of bed. Well, benefit might be, depending upon how you want to do this, benefit might be having a little bit more restful sleep and feeling a little bit better when you finally do get up. The cost might be you're going to lose your job. And when you start weighing benefits and costs, you go, I'm getting up. On the other hand, you don't have anything to do today and you want to stay in bed another 10 minutes and you start thinking about, well, the value of my time is not really sacrificed here. I wasn't going to start my day until 10 o'clock or whatever. Anyway, you stay in bed. You're going to make those decisions, and economics is about that. It's very comprehensive, and it applies in so many places. Uh, in fact, it's a wonderful major because it allows you to work just about anywhere that people have problems. And we solve problems and we tell stories. You'll see that later. That's what economists do. Now, your diligence early on is going to pay dividends later because these first three modules, I know you've already had two modules, but the first three modules based upon your textbook are absolutely critical. And you need to get tens on every single quiz because if you don't master these, later on it's going to hurt you because so many things are foundational in economics. Now, you've already done a great job in reading through economics in one lesson. And in that, I called it the first economic evidence assignment. And sometimes when we think of evidence, we go and we think, well, where's the data? Data evidence, right? That's what we're leading to. Yes, but you can't do data without a firm foundation. And for example, when Hazlitt talked about all groups and all time periods, um, he's talking about getting information on all groups and all time periods and using that in the way you solve. So what do we find here? One of the things is it's kind of a problem in being an economist is that everyone is one. And by that I mean everybody operates in the economic sphere. You do. And maybe you've never had an economics course before, but you've been operating as an economist because what do economists do? They solve problems. And what do you do every day? You solve problems. You only have so much money in your wallet, and you've got to decide whether you're washing your clothes or buying some food or whatever. And you realize I don't even have enough time to do everything I want to do. Suddenly you're in a world of choice. And you'll notice that was chapter two's title. Um, you have to make choices because of that. Now, some economists are not very good economists, and I'm first to tell you that. And I'm not going to tell you necessarily who are good and who are bad economists. I want you to figure that out as you start reading and understanding that there are some economists there that are just not very good. Um, and Bastiat, through Hazlitt, told us about these. In fact, we were warned of the good and the bad economist. Bad economists do not see, and here's my indictment, or do not look for everything. And what do we mean by everything? We mean that good economists are considering all groups that are affected by something and all time periods. So, um, a suggestion that we're going to, uh, by the federal government, suddenly relieve student loans. That sounds wonderful if you only think about people who have student loans, but think about the other groups that are involved. Um, Good economist considers all of those. And I'm not suggesting that just by raising the question and thinking of other groups that we automatically say we shouldn't do that, relieve economic loans for students, or that we should. It's consider everything. What is the cost imposed upon others in order to give benefit to a few? And is that in society's best interest and so forth? There's a lot of stuff there to unpack, but you're never going to be able to solve the problem if you don't look at every single group affected and overall time periods. There's this immediate thing that sounds really good, but we also know that large governmental infusions of dollars are inflationary. And where are we in 2022? We're in a very high inflationary period. All right. So it's not an easy solution. And if it was easy, everybody could do it. Now, there's no role for opinion and emotion in economic analysis. What do I mean by this? Well, first off, I just used the example of student loans. Should we forgive them? Well, should is down at the bottom, which is a normative statement. It can't be tested. I can say, yes, we should. And you frankly can't argue with me except by expressing your own opinion, right? Because you'll say, well, I don't think we should. And I think, well, I think we should. And how do we come to a conclusion on that? Well, let's back up just a little bit. What we want to do when we solve problems is we want to look at just the facts. And the question of just the facts is, what do I know? What can I find out? What's the possible things that are going on here? And what facts? Well, what are the facts for every group? What, maybe that comes down to cost and benefits, or what are the facts for every time period? Again, we're collecting that kind of economic evidence. You may see in your notes this idea of a positive statement or positive economics, and the first thing is to always assume black and white, right? So opposites, and if there's positive, there must be negative. So if there's a positive economics, there must be negative. No, that's not what it meant. It, the word positive, if you see that used, it comes from logical positivism. It's a system of logic, but basically what it comes down to, I think one of the most simple ways, and of a logician would probably argue with the simplicity of that, but a positive statement can be tested. For example, a positive statement is the moon is made of green cheese, and you're thinking, okay, that's not right. Um, well, but it can be tested, right? All we have to do is build a rocket, send it to the moon, collect some pieces of the moon, bring them back, take a look at them, and ask the question, is it green cheese? And the answer is no. And well, it was tested. It's still a positive statement, right? Now, a normative statement can't be tested because it's based on norms. And certainly you can test it against your own norms, but that defeats the purpose. For example, if you're very conservative, your set of norms is going to be very different than if you're very liberal. If you're very religious, your norms are going to be different than if you're not religious, and so forth and so on. And your statements will come out of those norms, those emotions, those opinions, and you'll be saying things like, we ought to do this, we ought to do that. And those can't be tested. It's not that there's no place for that in economics. That layers on top. So, first thing we want to do is we want to test the positive. Now, in doing this, short little divergence, but not really. Just because your book doesn't mention cause and effect doesn't mean it's the number one thing that economists do. And I happen to like this book, by the way, which is by Judea Pearl. It's called The Book of Why, and I would recommend it to you. Uh, Half of that book is readable by everyone, and it's very accessible. Uh, Causal calculus is a very tough area, and Judea Pearl is in the forefront of that. He is not an economist. In fact, he's a computer scientist, but he's very concerned with how computers can figure out causality. Artificial intelligence and so forth are part of all of this and so forth. We'll get some hints at all this. We're not going to do that directly. But economists come down to basically trying to answer questions like, does X cause Y? And if X causes Y, then of course we've got some, we got a principle. We can say, okay, every time X occurs, something happens. Well, there is a set of things that we have to concern ourselves about, and that is, what are the criterias for causation? Well, the first is X and Y have to have covariation, or let's call it correlation. They have to be related. Somehow there has to be some relation there. Now, that relation may not always be observable. For instance, there might be a correlation between how much education somebody has and how much salary they earn. But let's say you went and collected data and all you talked to were college freshmen. Or all you talked to were, people in a certain education level, and then you start saying, is there a relationship between education and wages or earnings? And you go, no, I don't see one. Well, it's because there's no variation, no variance in education. But if you have a full spectrum of people with education, a full spectrum of people with earnings, you'd find a correlation if indeed education causes earnings to be higher. And all of you are hoping that that's true because you're taking more education and you're hoping that your earnings and so forth are higher. Now, The other thing that has to happen is X must precede Y temporally. That is, your education has to come before your earnings. Otherwise, it can't be causation. It can be correlation because you can get things backwards. It could be that Y caused X, and in that case, maybe it's Y preceded X, but all you're looking at is X and Y, and you're going, they're related, and I'm now putting my bias on this, and I'm saying X causes Y. Principle two is very important. It has to be temporally preceded. Now, the third is third variables are controlled. Now, third variables stand for a whole lot of things, and if you've dabbled in any of this at all in any of your other courses and studies, these are called everything from co-founders to or confounders to what have you. Anyway, these are variables that upset or influence the relationship between X and Y. So does education cause higher earnings? It could very well be that what we're looking at is something like this, that those with higher education earn more income, and we could just leave it at that, or those with higher education earn more income for a given ability level. In other words, ability becomes a confounder, and those with higher ability will convert their education into earnings at higher and higher levels. It makes sense, right? So if we ignore ability, we're going to get a wrong answer in the causation, especially if we try to quantify that in any way. So this is part of the ways that economists use economic modeling. A model is both theoretical and empirical, has to be both. And we're going to be studying a lot of theory in here. And in theoretical models, we use a lot of functional mathematics. Functional mathematics means that we can write the equations, but we don't know whether they're linear or nonlinear. We don't know the exact parameterization of it or whatever, but we can identify what are the important variables. We can identify what are the important factors that lead to our into our model. In other words, is it X and Y, or is it X and X1, X2, X3, and Z, and all kinds of other variables that we have to make sure that we understand. Now, theory, the best way to understand it is the story that you're telling. It answers the question why. And that's one of the things that, if I was say anything about economists, the fundamental thing about all economists is they're obsessed with the question why. If you tell an economist that X and Y are related, they should very quickly be going, why is that the case? Tell me your story. Tell me why X and Y are related. Why is education associated with better wages? Maybe it has nothing to do with the education. Maybe it's employers only hire people who have higher education, employers with really good jobs. And in which case it's not the education, it's the employer's choice. See, that's a real big issue. In fact, that was called the screening hypothesis and investigated deeply through the 70s in economic research, because a lot of people believe screening. All right, economists solve problems and tell stories. They have to be related. Empirical model is both empirical and theoretical, it consists of math and of data. Now, math is the linear or nonlinear, parametric or non-parametric equations and formulas. And it can be anything from accounting, which is simple adding up, not to say accountants are simplistic, that's not the point, but those equations are very simple. Or it could be very, very complex mathematical expression, but we're modeling now mathematically what's going on. Most of you in engineering, that's not a big surprise, right? But what kind of model you put in there that's the math. Then data is the evidence, but the data can be incomplete and it can be measured imprecisely, or it can be measured indirectly. Indirectly, proxies, for example, are variables. I mentioned ability a few minutes ago. Nobody who studies wages and education linkages have access to ability measures. They have access to IQ scores or things like that, some test that's been given to kind of get at ability. It's not really ability, it's how well people did on that test. And is the test a good proxy for this thing we can't normally measure, like ability? Now, in the middle, we can see what data leads us to. We can sort that data, and that pile is a little bit better. We can arrange it somehow and we get a little bit more, and we can present it visually. And a lot of data analysts stop right there. They take the data, they turn it into a bar graph or something for their boss and present it, and we're done, right? It's up to him to figure out what the rest of it is. Economists don't do that. You tell what that pile is with a story, and you can kind of get that. Now, where did the data come from? That's important. Who created it? Is it created in a biased way? Is it created in a consistent way over time? How's it measured? Is the measurement something that we can work with, or if we understand the measurement, is it something that we can actually use? And when? Is this new data, old data? Who owns the data? And does that make a difference in any respect to the quality of that data? How is it collected? Was it telephone surveys or what? I heard a pollster just the other day talking about a lot of polls are biased towards Democrats, these political polls. And I thought he made a wonderful point, because he said the reason was a pollster will call up and say, or visit somebody or mail them a survey, and it will have 30 questions. And this takes a lot of time. And most people don't answer 30 questions. But guess who does answer 30 questions? Highly educated people. So then when you get to the end of the survey, you discover that your education level and so forth, how high have they gone in college and whatever, is off the chart, way out of relationship with the society. So all of a sudden, the very idea that you ask a long survey has leaned it towards a liberal perspective. Now, it doesn't mean that's what that is, but liberals are more likely to be higher educated, or vice versa, and and conservatives are more likely to be lesser. Now, that's not a definite thing, right? But it allows for some bias to creep in. And so when you end up with a survey that is collected from people who, by their, and here's the word that just plagues economic analysis, by their self-selection, uh, I'll be honest with you. I get a phone call and they say, "Can you take a few minutes to answer some questions?" And no, I don't typically participate. So I'm a little bit different from what um, they have said. I said earlier that higher educated people are more likely to answer long surveys, and it's an affinity for long surveys. You did that all through college. You understand it. You might even have empathy for the people calling you up because you've done some of those things as well. On the other hand, if somebody calls up and says, "I only need a minute of your time. I've got three questions," I might say yes. And so might a whole lot of other people who are just busy and they don't want to give the time, but they'll answer three questions. All right. So, how you collect it is very critical. And is the survey qualitative or quantitative? That by itself will tell you something. So, all of these kind of questions are very important. The book that's over there, and I forgot to give a link to it, but you can certainly search for it. I actually have a uh, article in there about ethics in economics, but ethics is really important, because if I know a survey is biased, but I want to convince everybody that everybody thinks a certain way and you should too, or whatever, I'm going to use it. It's not ethical, right? So I highly recommend this text. Bill Franks is a really good data scientist. In this course, you're going to use Fred. Fred is introduced in chapter one, and you should get a free uh, account right away. You may find that it's fun to go look up the unemployment rate when everybody's talking about news. Just go to Fred, look up unemployment rates, and it will do it. Here, what we see, for instance, is inflation of an earlier period versus the federal debt. And, can we draw any kind of implication about that? People say we're back in the high inflationary period of the 70s and 80s, and there was the Volcker cure. He was head of the Federal Reserve Bank, and he locked down money supply so badly, sent the economy into two severe recessions at the beginning of the Reagan presidency, but he broke inflation. Now, they're at the highest. It was, getting near 16% inflation in the country, and afterwards we've had relatively low inflation. Excuse me. So we've had relatively low core inflation, around 2% or so, for a long time, and then recently it was close to zero, and all of a sudden it's skyrocketing again. Anything changed dramatically? Well, what about deficits? And particular deficits in 2020, 2021 were absolutely massive. Is it any wonder that 37, some say 40 years of low inflation is currently over? Now, when we model, data alone will not get us to the answers. So if we only have an empirical model, which sadly is much of what data analytics is all about, um, and depending upon how you get that data analytics or what people are asking for, or sometimes the only question the boss knows to ask for is, take this data and tell me what it says, right? So in that, what we're doing is we're looking for associative relationships such as correlations or trends over time. And this does answer to what question? What's been happening to inflation over time? Go collect the data, look at the trend. Is it related to the deficit? Well, we just had that graph. We can look at that. But by itself, all it allows us to do is do some empirical extrapolation or forecast into the future. It doesn't tell us anything about answering the why question or helping us solve a problem. It just is what it is. It's the answer to the what question. So you need economic theory and data. And when you get that, now you're into data, what I consider good data science. A lot of people use data science and they don't include what I'm talking about here. But good data science, good economic modeling, you have economic theory, and you have your data. You're looking for causal relationships. You're trying to answer the why question. And in the future, what you can do is predict. Now, why do we care about prediction? Because the test of a theory is its ability to predict. It means that when something happens, this other thing always occurs. Remember what I said about causal relationships? Well, here's your first one. Demand increases and or supply decreases cause prices to increase. That's in module 3. You're going to learn that theoretically, and a professional economist will be applying that with data. We are able to make unambiguous predictions based upon just that right there. That's supply and demand. That's coming up in module 3. Now, one of the things the book talks about is how we measure the size of the economy, the gross domestic product. And a formula you'll see in module 11, remember this is an introductory chapter, so we're really talking about the whole of what's coming up, is that GDP is made up of consumption. That would be what you and I and other consumers spend. Investment, that's what private firms put into the economy. Government spending, and actually when politicians are trying to convince you to do something, they say, we, the federal government, are making an investment in the future doing by these dollars. It's not investment. It is government spending money in order to achieve something, right? And then the last two are the exports minus the imports. It's a very small overall portion of the economy, but that's what adds up. That's an accounting identity, by the way. So if consumption is 68% of GDP, which it has been forever, um, and G suddenly goes up dramatically in year 2000 and 2001, that has an impact, right? And now we can trace that through, and that's why a lot of you're seeing a lot of the inflationary pressures that's there. But let's look at GDP directly. I want to compare U.S., which ranks number one in the world and has for a long time, uh, the U.S., which has a current GDP, 2020 numbers, of almost $21 trillion, and China is 14, almost $15 trillion behind, right? So currently in 2020, China ranks number two in the world, and they're 70% the size of the United States. But what about just 20 years ago? China was 13th in the world and represented only 11% of the US. So one thing here is that things change. China grows at an annual growth rate that's astronomical. Um, and there's reasons for that. Doesn't mean they're necessarily better in everything. It simply means that when you start at a lower point, it's easier to catch up than it is when you're at a high point and you're trying to still progress. Okay. Now, this says China is the number two country in the world in GDP, in the size of the economy. It's the second largest economy in the world. That's absolutely true. But what if we divide GDP by its population? We get GDP per capita, or a really good measure of uh, the standard of living. So what happens here is we see that currently U.S. standard of living, if you took the size of the economy and divided it by the population, every resident gets about $63,000 if it was just distributed evenly, right? Now, don't immediately jump to, I'm currently struggling on 10,000. I'd like somebody to give me the 50. Let's even everybody out. That would be disastrous for reasons you will figure out, but of course you'd want it. Um, what happens though in China? It's only 10,000 a year, but 20 years ago it was only 1,000 a year. So what we're looking at here is that China, on a standard of living, is a much poorer country than the United States. Now, another thing talked about in your text is the Index of Economic Freedom. And this is done by heritage.org. It's done every year, and it's based upon 12 economic freedoms, the scores of which are applied to every country in the world. So every country in the world has a score on property rights. And those countries that respect property rights, that means do you have the free ability to own property, and can you dispose of it freely, and so forth and so on, um, you get a very high score. Now, the other things that you see there are also very important: judicial effectiveness, government integrity, and so forth. And there are 12 of these that make up the overall score. Well, the first thing you might want to ask is, where do we rank? Where's the U.S. rank in the world in economic freedom? We're the number one economy. Aren't we the number one freest economy in the world? Well, no, the answer is we're number five. But of course, that was in 2008. One of the things that's been happening worldwide is an erosion of economic freedoms in many countries. And what do we see in the US? Well, by 2017, we were only the 17th freest country in the world. And this year, we have fallen to 25th. Now, you'd have to go into the rankings and read the reasons and so forth. I'm not here to tell you why that is the case, but there are things that have happened that, um, maybe it's government spending off the chart, or restrictions on property rights that have happened here in the US, or other sorts of freedoms that have occurred. Not the point for right now, but I hope you go and look at that kind of information and, yeah, see what it says. Well, here's some other evidence. Singapore is the number one freest country in the world according to this score. And you can see it in blue there at the top. And the United States is shown, they're 25th. their scores are high. So the United States is considered a mostly free country, not a free country, again, according to the score. China, on the other hand, is a mostly unfree and has fallen into uh, a repressed, I should change the title, into a repressed uh, country by 2022. They were mostly unfree in 2021, where you see 58.4. Now, what's going on there? What is that level of repression? Well, let's take a case study, which is Venezuela, and the socialist revolution came in uh, decades ago, and you can go look up history of all of that. But what happened is that from becoming a mostly unfree country in 2000, and indeed they were even much higher before, it has eroded over time to where they are now the 176th country in terms of a score on economic freedom. So, whatever Venezuela may or may not have, it's definitely not a free place to live. And you got to be low on all 12 of those scores to be 176 in the country, because below you are countries they're not able to measure, like North Korea and those sort of places that they just don't have data on. Now, what does it mean for a country to have economic freedoms? And I think what we're looking at here is associations. What favorable traits of a country are associated with higher levels of economic freedom? Well, the first one is the standard of living is higher for countries who have higher levels of economic freedom. So economic freedom goes left to right there on the horizontal axis. So countries over there on that far side, you see Singapore and Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, they all tend to have higher levels of GDP per capita, our standard of living that we just talked about. And the size of the bubble there is the size of the country. So the big bubbles down there in the mostly unfree section in 2017 is China and India, Indonesia, and so forth. And you can see the United States there where it is. Free screen, take a look at it if you wish. Now, another view of this is, let's just take a look and say, what is the average standard of living, GDP per capita, for countries that are free? It's $73,000. Mostly free, it's 42. This is all mostly free countries. How about mostly unfree and repressed? The standard of living is $7,000. Now, this is PPP, it's purchasing power parity. It's sort of an accountant financial nightmare to try to figure out how to create one currency that all other currencies relate to, and of course it changes regularly. Um, so when we take those scores, we can actually compare them. Those are equivalent dollars uh, between all those different types of countries. Well, that ought to tell you right there, you want to be in a free country, right? So what else do we find out? What else is associated with higher economic freedom? Free countries are more likely to have higher scores on the UN's Human Development Index. All right, so there is this index. If you want to know, go look at the references. What is in human development? Free countries have higher human development scores. Free countries have better environmental performance. Free countries have more innovation. Free countries have more democratic governance. Free countries make greater social progress. So free countries are more progressive in the sense of the 2021 Social Project Progress Index. Again, you have to go look at that. I'm not telling you what this means or how it's measured or whatever. But if you look at this on virtually every single index we took a look at, better things are associated with more economic freedom. Now, where are the countries that are economically free? It turns out it's very rare. Dark green are your free countries. Light green are your mostly free countries. And red is your repressed countries. Most of the world is not free. Now, in terms of this, you can say, well, gee, that's just the heritage index. And, I think heritage is an organization that's so biased and, whatever, I don't want to pay any attention to it. Well, how about a report from slate.com, a very left-leaning, they report on a different data, which is freedomhouse.org, and they have a title, March 21st, less than 20% of the world's population now lives in a free country. Now, you can read the article. I didn't, to know exactly what they're talking about, but there's a different data set coming up with essentially the same thing I just told you. What about Cato? It's a very right-leaning libertarian organization. What do they show? Freedom in decline. 83% of the world's population, based upon, yet again, a different measure of this. So here's three different measures talking about economic